we've got loads of people registered, and I can see people coming in. Due to the time constraints, we're going to have to get going, I'm afraid. So there will be people who miss this introductory bit. Hopefully you find this extremely interesting and exciting. I know that I'm watching with great interest the introduction of ideas around design coding into mainstream design approaches. So let me just very quickly explain what we'll be doing. Let me just, this is a bit where we have tech issues. You're here today, webinar 1. We have 3 of them actually on this series. We ran some last year and I think they were very successful. They were well attended, and given that people were very new to the format, I was suitably impressed with how things have transitioned to online sessions, and they were perfectly interactive, and they kept a lot of the qualities of meeting face to face. So today we're talking about design coding and planning, the National Model Design Code, and about what it's going to take to implement this in any way, and where problems may lie. Later in the month, we have a really interesting session on cycling. You've got to register for that. Cycling is it. It's where all kind of good design decisions are heading. It is, you know, simultaneously the transportation of the past and of the future, which is fantastic to see. And I think the pandemic and people's adjusting attitudes to how they want to travel during that time have been really kind of interesting. And then we've got right tree, right place, right street, which is again picking up on changes in within sort of emphasis within design and planning, and requirements to put street trees back in. Sounds easy, not actually that easy to do, and we'll be talking in detail about that towards the end of the month. So why are we here today? Well, this is the blurb that you've seen, so I won't dwell on this, but we have coming down the road and being trialled right now, the National Model Design Code. This is supporting the National Design Guide, which was launched in 2019. Some of you will be familiar with that and will have spent some time reading through that, but the code is different, and we're going to talk about that in detail and have a panel discussion about it. Just to recap on what the National Design Guide is, it is a kind of, it is a guide, and you'll be familiar with guides because we've had them in our planning system for decades now. It's slightly different in terms of emphasis, and it works by having basically 3 overarching themes: climate, character, and community. There's a problem historically with design guides. They tend to be quite siloed, and there's something about the order that you put things in which kind of indicates how important something is. The National Design Guide tries to graphically demonstrate that actually all these things need to be done simultaneously, and you can't just say we'll do one of these 10 kind of things that's in there without also simultaneously considering all the others. So it's got these 3 overarching themes, and then it's got what they call 10 characteristics of a well-designed place. I won't go through them, but what's interesting about this, and this is where this particular document differs from previous design guides, is that it actually describes the outcome that they want. It describes the performance criteria of a well-designed place. It doesn't necessarily tell you how to do it, but it does say you will know you've achieved it when you have these 10 things in place. It is a slight shift in emphasis. It makes it quite an interesting document. More recently, we have the National Model Design Code. Now, for those of us working in the design industry like myself, we are used to dealing with design codes. We're not used to dealing with them on a national scale, and we're certainly not used to dealing with them in volume. They tend to be quite place specific. They tend to be very much linked to a specific project. The National Model Design Code is a bit different. It's got a much wider scope. I'm sure you've all read it, right? All 50 odd pages of the main document and the 90 odd pages of the supporting document. But this is what it does. It sets out the purpose of it. It sets out its objectives. It sets out how you apply it. Again, I'm not going to read off the screen. And this is kind of what it looks like. It sets out a process. And we've got our other speakers today will be talking through this in more detail. it's a very graphically beautiful document, actually, produced in part by Urbed, and they've done a lot of work putting in examples of the sorts of things you might do and what type of output you might expect. It's worth mentioning at this point, though, that the National Model Design Code is not a design code in itself. It is a process that you follow to produce your own design codes. We'll be talking about this more. But for now, I want to hand over to, we've got a great panel today. We've got Phil Smith, we've got Dr. Laura Alvarez, we've got Luke, who's going to be dealing with from the house building industry. I think it's very interesting that we've got a spread of people from local authority, from the design industry, from people at the coalface on delivery. Phil, I'm going to hand over to you now to talk us through your presentation. I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you, Gary. Right, let's see if I can share my screen. I think I've managed to unmute myself. Okay, can you see the presentation? Is it there? Can we see that? Yeah, great. Okay, so my name is Phil Smith. I work for 2 local authorities in Derbyshire, and I'm the Urban Design Officer supporting the planning departments in both Chesterfield Borough and Bolsover District Councils. So we've only got 10 minutes. I'm just going to rattle through some of these things. This is really just to kind of give us a sense of where it fits together in terms of the big picture. So Living with Beauty report published by the Build Better, Build Beautiful Commission in January 2020, and that had 45 recommendations on how design and beauty should be brought more front and centre into the planning system. As a result of that, we now have the NPPF published in January, end of January this year, which explains the updates proposed to the NPPF in relation to design and a number of other topics. We've got the National Design Guide already mentioned by Gary, and the National Model Design Code is identified at the end of the design guide as something that would follow, which we now have, which sits just underneath that. Accompanying it, there's now the National Model Design Code guidance as well. So there's good cross-referencing between the design code and the design guidance. So there'll be sections highlighted within the design code where you can find out more information in the guidance that sits alongside it. And that provides the process, as Gary's outlined, which would inform how we do this locally. And there's a big emphasis on community engagement as well. So we need to prepare a community engagement strategy. So that's kind of how it all fits together. These are the changes to the NPPF in relation to design. I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's sort of an aid memoir if you want to come back to it later. But I've just picked out a couple of key points, one of which is the need for local design preferences to be expressed. So we somehow have to find out what that means and how to obtain that information. And that the National Design Guide and the National Code will be relevant to making decisions on planning applications where local authorities don't have their own guidance in place or their own codes in place. So it's a sort of fallback position. I'm not quite sure how that would work yet, given that it's about how to code rather than, but I guess it includes good practice principles. Some of the key points are that it's effectively to assist with the production of design codes, guidance and policies. It expands on the 10 characteristics of good design in the National Model Design, in the National Design Guide, provides more detail around that. It says it's not a statement of government policy, but it does go on to say that the government recommends that it's followed by local authorities. So I'm not quite sure what that means in terms of its status, but I think it means it's quite important. And just to recap, that's the 10 characteristics in the National Design Guidance that Gary's already mentioned. So interestingly and helpfully, the subject areas and all the colour coding is exactly the same in the National Model Design Code as set out here in the design guide. So it cross-references quite nicely. It's quite easy to follow, makes it a bit easier to understand. The coding process itself consists of 3 stages and 7 steps, which makes it sound quite straightforward. I think it's probably going to be quite complicated. The 3 stages of this analysis stage, which includes the scoping of the document, preparing your baseline evidence, the visioning stage, where we need to set a design vision, prepare your coding plan, which might include identifying key sites and allocations that you would expect to be coded, and possibly master planned as well, part of that process. And then preparing the code itself based on area types, or preparing an area-wide design guide. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a code as a set of instructions as we might normally understand it. Critically, at each of these stages, there has to be public consultation and engagement. And this is something that I'm going to sort of focus on a little bit rather than the actual content of the guide, is that there's a big emphasis on making sure that the, however it's prepared, that there's a heavy involvement of the community to support the guidance. So in addition to that, it states that there should be a minimum of eight characteristics that need to be considered, and these are sort of set out here: movement, access, landscape and open space, etc. Number of homes, that would be relevant if you were looking at a specific site. I'm not sure how that would apply to a sort of wider area. So we've got at the scoping stage to prepare a consultation strategy. So this is pretty much right at the beginning. The level of engagement needs to will vary according to the scale, so effectively it needs to be proportionate. The level of coverage itself also has to be consulted on and agreed. So will it be the whole area? Will it be a specific site, a town, a village? That all has to be sorted out at the beginning. Local authorities will need to probably need to brief and train the groups and interested parties involved, assuming that we can get people engaged in the process, because I think we're going to have to bring everybody up to a certain level. First and foremost might be understanding how the planning system works, and then how the coding might sort of fit into that, and that the stage one engagement will itself inform the consultation strategy. So before you even have a consultation strategy, you have to be consulting on how all this is going to fit together. So it's quite a lot of work up front. The baseline situation is that the local authorities will need to understand their area based on or informed by evidence and recent evidence, however that's defined, and that might consist of analysis and characterization studies with input from the community. And there's an expectation in this that the local authorities will have a lot of this information on GIS already. So just in the examples here, for one site, there's a lot of work goes into assessing and understanding the context for the development. And as you have to kind of scale that up for more sites or whole areas, that could be quite an intensive process. This is an example from Purbeck District Council that I worked on some years ago, where we looked at the characterization of a number of towns and villages. And we looked at movement, heritage, topography, landscape setting, planning designations, and other things, and also characterized the settlements by character type, as we called it, which I think would be area type in the new design coding. We also need to set a vision. So that it says local authorities may wish to create a vision statement, but we have to have some sort of vision, and that has to be agreed with the community. And it goes on to say that we should be, one approach could be to identify area types within a settlement. So just to go back to the Purbeck example, within one small village, we identified 7 different character types, and then had to kind of go on and define what these might be. And we went on to look at strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats to each of these. We didn't go as far as coding for what it might consist of, but we were asked to rate the townscape, if you like, in terms of, we called it critical, constant and tradable. How sensitive was it to change if development was to take place there? So there's perhaps different ways to approach it, but the emphasis is on engagement and not consultation. So it's a big difference, I think, with the way we've traditionally done things as a profession. Engagement at every stage, we have to demonstrate measurable community support, although that's not readily defined. I've mentioned it needs to be proportionate to the scale of what we're looking at. So if you're looking at a particular development site, you're probably going to target a particular community, a particular area. If you're looking at an area-wide code, it's going to be different, probably more inclusive and more extensive. But there's an expectation that you'll use a range of tools to reach a wide audience, and that would be both in-person and digital methods. So perhaps, again, slightly different to the way we're used to doing things, and that we need to be inclusive and include a broad range of people, including hard-to-reach groups. These are all mentioned specifically. Traditional workshops and drop-in sessions is the sort of thing we're used to. At Chesterfield recently, we've had a a consultation on our HS2 station master plan. Because of the COVID restrictions, consultants have done this as a sort of digital virtual drop-in session with videos and briefings, and you can click on each of these areas and move around the room and then fill in your comments form and provide feedback. And it's really quite a creative way of doing it. There may be something more of that nature. I may also need to think about social media, doing things online in ways that's convenient for people, really, going to them rather than them coming to us. So in terms of who's responsible, we've got obviously local authorities will be probably leading on a lot of this. Developers and landowners will be promoting their own sites. It's not, I haven't seen any mention of parish and town councils, but I would imagine they'd be key stakeholders as part of any process in a lot of local authorities. You're going to need a multidisciplinary team of people probably, as well as facilitators to help broker those discussions and community engagement. Potential pitfalls on my mind are obviously skills and resources in local authorities, and all the issues around that. Kind of building community consensus and trust is challenging in itself, and a reliance on developer-led codes. And also highway authorities, there's a lot of emphasis on placemaking in street and public realm. Obviously highway authorities have a sort of different sort of remit, and manual for streets hasn't really kind of hit home in a lot of highway authorities. So just to kind of bring this to a conclusion then, I've sort of broken this down, and these are the required steps in my mind as I've sort of been trying to work out how we might go about doing this. I'm not saying this is the way, and there are probably lots of other steps in between, but this is sort of the step-by-step process I'm trying to sort of envisage in terms of trying to make this work. And you can see there's a lot of overlap here with the community engagement on the main stages, but I think there's also going to be a kind of some leading work required in terms of working out in-house how we go about doing this and getting the resources required to do it. So in terms of sort of final thoughts from a local authority perspective, how are we going to get the resources to do this? Financial, staff and technology, context. Can you code every site? Should you code every site? Is that the right thing to do? Because life is messy and every site's different. So, perhaps we should be looking at this in a slightly different way. Community buy-in is going to be a big challenge. How much time do we get to get all this in place? I'm not quite sure yet. Getting the baseline stuff together is going to be a big challenge for a lot of local authorities, and that's a big piece of work in itself. What status does our current SPD have, and can we rely on it? How do we demonstrate measurable community support? The scope of the challenge is big. Do we look at whole areas or specific sites? If we collaborate with partners, should we work with our neighbouring local authorities to do a joint guide? But if we do that, we're going to have more of a challenge in terms of community engagement. And there's all the upfront work in terms of getting the corporate buy-in and leadership and management sort of on board with it as well to help us to do this. So that's my take on it at the moment. Sorry, I'm slightly over time, Gary.
No, you've done really well. Thank you, Phil. That's brilliant. Laura, we've got you up next to do your presentation. If you want to share your screen, but also just introduce yourself quickly, that would be great. Just for our participants, everyone in the audience, if you've got questions, if you pop them into the, I know we've got a Q&A function on Zoom, but if you could pop your questions into the chat box, Julie and Joe are going to collect them together and send them out for the panel, so that that's the best place for you to be able to have both a discussion and to ask questions to the panel. Thank you. Cheers. Go on, Laura. Sorry.
Hi, thanks for that. I'm going to have to speak very, very fast because I've got a lot to go through. I'm Laura Alvarez from Nottingham City Council, and I will explain to you our experience as a local authority in implementing something similar and how we work with this planning reform. The message is build, 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 which means reactivating the economy, particularly post-pandemic. Now this is going to become more relevant. And we have been seeing a planning reform for some time now. And I have been very busy looking at all the documents and all the releases from central government about this planning reform and what it actually means. And I managed to pull some, reading between the lines, some objectives that I think the government have. One of them is saving time and resources, not only in planning stage, but also during occupancy and for maintenance, waste collection, etc. We want to speed up the planning process because of the housing crisis, what got to the little numbers, and also to do with economic health. We want to eliminate risks so that costs and budgets are more accurate to start with. which will bring more confidence. And we want to manage or soften some potential opposition, especially to do with communities not wanting housing at the doorstep or on greenbelt. We want to increase confidence so that if we eliminate legal barriers and smooth up the process and make it more predictable, the investors will be keener. And we need to standardize the planning process so that we can evaluate design, so that we can meet those demands for building beautiful. And also there is here a hint of bringing the planning system to a level of automatization, by which I mean in the future I can envisage scanning a planning application and an artificial intelligence machine telling you whether you should get approved or not. Don't get me wrong, I still like planning offices, but I can see that that way we're going. So we in Nottingham had Planning Delivery Fund to deliver the local application of the National Design Guide. And we sat in a forum with central government whilst they were developing the National Design Guide. And at the same time, we did our design quality framework, which you can go and have a look online. Of course, we were aware that we were leaving the European Union, and so we lined that up to the Sustainable Development Goals to put this in at a global sort of parallel. And after that, the National Model Design Code came up, which is a template for local authorities to develop something similar to the design quality framework in their own style that suits them. So today I'm going to explain to you our process and perhaps give you some tips about how it worked for us. We believe that what is expected from sitting with the central government, we believe what is expected is on top, in addition of all the tools and documents. So we're not going to ditch local plans or SPDs or anything like that. This is on top of it. We're expected to develop whole city frameworks, area codes, and site-specific codes. Now, by the time we started developing our framework, Nottingham had all of those already. With the National Model Code, what they're saying is, if you are in a position like Nottingham, you have the skills, you have the resources, you can produce your own codes or guides or whatever you want to call it. And it's fine, there's enough flexibility. If you can't do that because you haven't got resources or skill, then you can adopt this model. I'm going to leave that for the debate for later on. Now, our experience in Nottingham was that we had very, very similar objectives to the national ones, because we, of course, were getting the pressure with resources and times, and we want investment in the city. The only thing we didn't have was the automatization. We didn't think, we still like planners, and we love our colleagues. So we think there's still that necessary human element to appraise schemes and to look at sites, because only humans perceive places the way we do. But we did want to achieve some consistency, especially to do with the way in which officers give feedback on planning applications, and perhaps different officers use different language or have different views. So we wanted to standardize that element. How we did that? In order to save time, and I cannot stress enough how important this is, the first stage was to do a very good audit. And I mean by an audit to understand where we were going wrong, where was quality not meeting the standards that we expected, but also having a look at how we work, what barriers along the way in the planning process we were finding to deliver that quality. And
Laura, I'm really sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure your slides are moving. You're still on the first slide here.
You're joking. Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Oh, no. I have like 10 slices. Right, hold on.
Yes, a bit frozen. Sorry, Laura.
I'm going to try something else. So you want not...
Go from current slide, that's it.
Right, okay, I'm going to... Sorry about that.
If you go into slideshow, it's that little icon on the very bottom.
Can you see me moving it now?
No.
Oh.
Maybe you should restart, Laura.
Sorry about that. Right.
There had to be one glitch. Don't worry.
It's an online event without at least some technical problems.
Can you see it now? Can you see it moving?
You're not on the presentation.
Sorry, you're gonna have to reshare your screen, Laura. Sorry to be a pain.
No, it's fine. Apologies for that. We tested it before, but there's always something wrong. Unless you want to share from your end. How all the timings?
Go on, Julie, go for it.
Just give me a second.
I should use this brief intermission to say that what we're going to do in the programme is we're going to run through our presentations. We will be roughly on time. We're going to give you guys 5 minutes to go grab a cup of tea or coffee or whatever, and then we'll come back and then we'll get into the chat. So yeah, we still should have good time for panel discussions. So be thinking of your questions to put to us. Actually, while we're waiting, Phil, there's a question here in the chat. How do you feel about answering that, or trying to? So there's an excellent question about resources and so on. Yeah,
I was just reading that. Somebody I work with, actually. Thank you, Rick. Yeah, it's going to be a massive challenge. I don't quite know how we're going to get there. All the presentations coming out now, isn't it? But tell me when you're ready, Julie. I think first and foremost, we have to kind of get this on the agenda internally within our organisation or organisations, so that there's an awareness that it's something that's expected that we have to do. So I think that needs to be a conversation with the sort of planning director and the management team, and get that onto the sort of leadership's radar, as it were, and then I think it will start to flow from there.
All right, brilliant. Laura, do you want to just tell Julie which slide you want her to jump across to, and we'll
yes,
go from
okay, the green one. So yes, we have to build, then we have the objectives. I'm happy to share this, no problem with that. So these are the objectives I identify: save resources, speed up planning, eliminate risk, increase confidence, and standardize the planning system. If you keep moving, Julie will catch up very quickly. So this is how the Nottingham Design Quality Framework lines up with all of this. And in the next one, please, the documents will be in addition. Something's going on with the format as well, but I'm going to just ignore everything today. It's not my day. So we are expected to look at whole city frameworks, area code, and site-specific codes. We had all of that in Nottingham. So what we had to focus on was the actual coding. So I'm going to now focus a bit more back onto what we did in Nottingham. The objectives were the same, only that we were not very keen on automatization. We still want planners. So if you keep going, Julie, I'll try to catch up with your speed. Instead, we wanted consistency in the way in which we give feedback about planning applications. Pass to the next one, please. So how we did it? To save time, the main thing for us, and it was really, really important, is to do the audit. Next, please. And keep pressing. I'll catch up with your speed. To eliminate what was going wrong. To speed up the process, we focused on the expectations that we had as an authority. And we put that very, very clearly. If you stay on that slide, please. We put that very, very clearly online in terms of the upfront information that we were expecting developers to send to us, the process that we were going to go through internally, how fast or who was going to look at what parts of the information at what time. And we also worked on our resources, which Phil also mentioned in his presentation, do an analysis of your resources to implement all this. To achieve that consistency, we created criteria, but we made it really, really focused. Instead of trying to code everything, we selected six key criteria per area of interest. And we tried to make it short and memorable and very focused, only trying to eliminate the things that kept going wrong all the time. So don't try to cover too much, but focus on trying to eliminate bad design. And then we created appraisal tools that meant that we could evaluate that criteria in a consistent way. So no matter which officer is dealing with your application, you will have a similar response. So we achieved consistent evaluation. If you pass to the next one, please. So that consistency was really, really important. We had a website where everybody can look at the same information at the same time, everyone from inside the council and from outside the council. That actually works really well. If you click again, please. And this evaluation works in a similar way as the first version of Building for Life with the traffic light system, and anybody can do it. But we don't do that for every planning application. We only use it when we have applications that are poor quality design or that we want to review again. And by doing this, what this does is it highlights the areas in which that project is not complying with our expectations. And when we have workshops on a review or something, we focus specifically on those areas without having to talk about all the aspects of the design, which saves a lot of time. If we go to the next one. So having done the audit and putting a plan into process and getting support, this is absolutely fundamental. Once you have that, get the support from leadership and from your own staff, because without that, there's no point having anything. Our first question was where will the DQF sit in the context of all the other existing policy and all the other tools, because we had lots already. Next one, please. We had the local plan, keep present. We had the urban design guide, that, and stay there, please. That was for the city boundary, only for the city centre. And then we put the design quality framework within the context of those. But what the design quality framework did is it was with a finer brush looking at design criteria that could deliver a strategic vision to do with character building and identity of the city. If we keep present, please. We also had all the standard areas within the local plan, designations and everything else. We had SPDs, and we are only using site-specific codes. So the only thing where we're coding is sites. Everything else has a design guide in our case. We think that codes is something very black and white, very particular, and you have to, character is very varied on site-by-site basis. So we couldn't code the whole city. Although other countries do it and do it very well, but they have different planning systems. If we move to the next one, please. Okay, so the second question we had is how are we going to give a guide enough weight? Because it has to work and it has to be strong enough if it's not going to be compulsory policy. And if you click once more, please. We did that by co-producing all of the design quality framework. And this is what the government is saying that we do, is asking us to engage at all times to work with the community so that the vision is shared. And that was fundamental for us because it saved a lot of time in the implementation stage. And it meant that we could also have those groups involved in the co-production of the framework, testing the tools with real life case studies. So if we go to the next one, please. And keep pressing. So we have three key spheres of engagement during the long-term engagement. We continues, it never stops. It's a forever engagement now. And we had the sphere of the city council staff at all departments, from maintenance to drainage, anyone. Then we had industry, professionals, RIBA, local practices. We had community groups invested in place, but also schools, businesses, and we worked with all of them. We worked with them separately, and then we started to merge them, the groups, and we ended up with mixed events. So that was so successful that now the guys are almost self-adopting and self-policing. It's community groups that come and ask us, are you using this? So it actually works really well. If we go to the next one, please. So after adopting all of this, so we did engagement, the co-production, we tested it, we adopted it. And in adoption phase, the first thing is to ensure that you still have the support, that you have that you give it the necessary weight, that it will work in practice. And the implementation, I cannot underestimate how much effort, time, skills, and resources that is going to take. It's not as simple as it seems. It's not a matter of we adopt it and that's it. And I'm going to go to that in a minute. If you go to the next one, please. In the implementation phase, I put here a few bullet points for things to consider. To do with in-house, you definitely need leadership support to implement this. The planning committee will need some sort of training or getting familiar with the tools. Next, keep pressing, please. You, with designated design champions across all teams, highways, maintenance, because there's always need to be someone who is familiar with all of this and how it works. We did in-house training. We had to develop software, websites, templates, and now we're monitoring and upgrading, which also is resource consuming. In terms of external parties, we had to make sure that it was clear when to apply each tool and where. There was consistency in all the documents that we produce, so that the evaluation and the feedback, everything was the same, consistency. And it had to be easy to adopt, and all of the above gave that assertiveness that officers needed to push for this. Right, next one, please. So what did we learn in Nottingham? First of all, the design quality is the product, the form and the function that you're going to code is as important as the process you use to achieve that. So both things need coding in a way. Leadership, staff support, and staff support is essential. The engagement and co-production up front with community work really, really well. You need to choose the right tool for the right scale. I don't think coding could work the same at a city level as it does at a site level. It requires different type of tools. The criteria needs to be very flexible to allow that sort of excellence building, delivering of innovation, but it has to be focused so that it could be appraised. Because one thing is to implement a code, and another thing is to every application will have to be checked against that criteria at some point. And implementation is key, and developing of skills is really, really one thing that is time consuming. The last one, please. So Boris Johnson says build, 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 and I am saying keep clicking. My message is skills, skills, skills. And that's all from me. Apologies for all the disasters. Something has got to go wrong all the time. There you go.
Brilliant. Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much. Luke, you're up next. Luke, I'll let you introduce yourself, and I'm interested to hear the kind of, the delivery side perspective of this, because I think it's going to be extremely interesting how this gets interpreted in your field.
Great. Thanks very much, Gary. Can I just check that that's showing on the screen at the moment? Well, thank you. Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm here to talk to you about the National Model Design Code, much like everyone else has been. I want to look at the why, the who, the how, and by that I mean, why do we have design codes? Who plays what role in these? So we've heard from local authorities. I want to give you more of a kind of a private sector insight into this. How do we go about delivering design codes, and how do we use them to create great places? A little bit about myself. I'm design director over at Barton Wilmore, and one of the design panel members of Design Midlands. So the National Model Design Code, we've heard a lot about it today, but in a nutshell, it's a code for a code. So it's an instruction book of how to create a code. Before we get into that, I just want to say that it's really, really important when we're discussing this to see the barriers and the issues and the complications and the solutions and the different design perspectives from people's different perspectives, be that whether they're in local authority, resident, consultee, developer, applicant, designer, and I think it's important to make sure that we consider that as we go along. So how did we get here? I know that Phil talked very quickly about the MPPF and the Building Better, Building Beautiful, but I think it's important to know how it is that we've got here. Place Alliance back in January 2020 undertook a housing audit. The outcome of that is that, in short, there's lots of mediocre and poor development. The Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, that's there, to drive up design standards, and the 45 recommendations have since been taken forwards. In addition to that, we've seen Building for Life 12 be replaced by Building for a Healthy Life. And that's really, really important because we're seeing more and more emphasis on health and well-being in new developments. Then we've also got the planning white paper. So that started to introduce the idea of zonal planning, the growth, the renewal and protection areas, and there the introduction on the delivery of these design codes and the requirement for design codes. That all culminates in the National Design Guide that Gary talked us through, and then the National Model Design Code that we're talking about today. So that's really, really important because we're now seeing that there's going to be a design coding requirement for all developments. We'll talk about this a bit later, but that's going to put increasing pressure on the local planning authorities to deliver these design codes. So why is it that we have design codes? In short, having a design code in place will enable everyone to ensure that the overall development delivers a consistently high level of quality, and that ultimately all of its elements come together effectively to meet the overall vision for the town. That was a quote that I took from the Northstowe Design Code. I think it captures really quite nicely why we have design codes, which is ultimately to deliver high quality developments, and more importantly, deliver them holistically that meet the needs of all of the people and all of the users. As I discussed earlier, there's different ways of looking at this. So I won't dwell on these too much, but local authorities can use design codes. It provides them with a benchmark for design. You know, it demonstrates what is good design, what is bad design. It provides a benchmark for approvals. If applicants are not meeting certain benchmark criteria, they should be refused. Similarly, if they are meeting them, they should be approved. So for the developer, for the applicant, it demonstrates what the expectations are for good design. It lets them know very, very clearly what is required when they're putting forward their applications. But similarly, it should give them reassurance. It should give them reassurance that if they meet all of these requirements, then they're going to get an approval on that application. And for someone like myself, a designer, urban designer, master planner, it clarifies what's expected, and that's really, really useful from both sides. So I often see ourselves as almost kind of referees between the developer applicant and the local authority. And it provides us with a kind of a rule book for discussions. So it enables me to chat to both my client and the local authority on, look, what's expected here? This is what we're trying to do. This is what we're trying to achieve. And this is how we're trying to achieve it. So ultimately, that's why we have design codes. So we can work together to deliver great places. And it's really, really important that we actually deliver these rather than just talk about them. So who plays what role? And this all came about back in the end of 2019. I hosted the Design Quality Summit. So the National Urban Design Conference was held in Birmingham, and there were three kind of key things to take away from that. We got a large panel. Laura was on that panel as well. The panel covered kind of academia, private developers, local authorities, regional authorities, and it was actually the launch of Design Midlands, funnily enough, that we had there. But two of the three important things were we really need to reconcile these aspirations. So reconcile the local authorities' aspirations, the developers' aspirations, and the designers' aspirations. And in addition, it's important to understand the constraints and the pressures of the differing roles. Who's trying to achieve what, and why are they trying to achieve it? So the local authority can almost be seen as the gatekeeper to approval. They're the ones that ultimately rubber stamp the planning approvals. They're there to either encourage or demand design quality. And you know, there can be a debate to be had on whether or not that should be more of a carrot or a stick approach. But similarly, they're under time and delivery pressures, resourcing pressures, and I know we've had some questions pop up in the Q&A, which we'll cover later on. In terms of the developer, they actually deliver the homes. They're delivering the homes that we need across the country. They do have commercial obligations, and that's why I talk about delivery of great places, because all of these aspirations need to be commercially viable in order to ensure that we can deliver these developments. And the developer itself is got its reputation at stake. It wants to leave a legacy. It wants to create a great place. Ultimately, throughout all of this, everyone wants to create a great place. And that's why we're here today talking about it. And what we all need to do is come together in order to be able to create those great places. And like I said before, as kind of designer or consultant, I see my role in kind of joining all the dots together. I'm there to facilitate this great design that meets the needs of the developer, but also meets the needs of the local authority, in addition to the local residents, stakeholders, and also, you know, ultimately just creating a great place. So how is it that we deliver codes and great places? Firstly, how do we deliver great places? And I'm going to attempt to tell you this in a slide or two. Clearly, it takes much longer. The third thing that came out of the Design Quality Summit was this need to balance design quality and delivery. And by that, I mean a considered balance. So balancing sort of utopian, inspirational, best practice exemplars and the strive to meet these great places, along with creating places that ultimately make money. They're commercially viable. And if we can combine those, that results in the delivery of great places. So if you really understand the site and really consider the design approach, you can actually add value to that site. Great design doesn't necessarily have to cost anything more. Just really consider where you're spending your money, where you're spending your effort, time and resources. And they use the term they're getting the most bang for your buck. So where you are embellishing stuff, put it in places where people can see it. So how do we actually deliver design codes? How do we deliver design codes that are going to deliver great places? As Phil talked about earlier, and we've seen in the questions there as well, you're absolutely right. There's going to be a high demand on local planning authorities to deliver these design codes. Some of those authorities will have limited resources. Some will have limited expertise. Creating really effective, really useful design codes that will deliver great places is actually a really, really hard thing to do. So I think, therefore, we're going to need the collaboration and co-delivery to produce these design codes. We're going to need to see private sector and public sector working together to share resources, share skills, and share expertise in order to produce these codes. So when we produce these codes, what do we need to do? We need to be very clear within the code what's flexible, what's fixed, what's non-negotiable, and what's guidance. It needs to be very, very clear in there that if you come forward with an application that doesn't adhere to these specific points, it will get refusal. Similarly, it needs to be very, very clear if you do meet those points that it gets an approval. Be precise, be detailed. Where it's really, really important, where it's absolutely crucial that a certain design element is met, be precise. Rather than saying, you know, we want generous front gardens, if it's really, really important at that point that you have 4.5 metre front gardens, write 4.5 metre front gardens. If it doesn't, then don't. Allow flexibility for innovation. State the desired outcome, not the solution. So in that case, if what you're actually trying to achieve is a green street scene by having the larger front gardens, don't specify the dimensions of the gardens, specify what the desired outcome is. If what you are trying to create is a green leafy street scene, state that as the requirement and allow for innovation in how that's being answered. Similarly, create flexibility for changes over time. We've just seen with COVID that certainly the market's changed dramatically. And the way people are living has changed dramatically. I've never seen people use their front garden so much before, where they never did before. So again, if you state within that design code what it is you're trying to achieve, great. If you don't have to state the solution, then let the designer do that, and that won't stifle innovation. Importantly, ensure that the proposals are deliverable and commercially informed. Like the Venn diagram earlier, it's all down to this considered balance. In order to create great places, they actually have to be delivered. And for them to be delivered, they need to be commercially viable. So when you're creating that design code, make sure that you've got people in your team with experience of actually delivering places. All that being said, things change over time. So within that, allow yourself scope to revisit the code, review the code, and revise the code. Design changes, people change, lifestyles change, and markets change. You will learn as well. If you're doing a really large development, after building the first, second, third phase, you will have learned a lot. And those lessons should be implemented onto subsequent phases. So how do we use these design codes? So those that follow the design code, those applications that come in that adhere to the design code should be approved, and there should be a quicker approval. There should be an incentive for following them. Those solutions that meet the requirements of the design code should be approved. And by that, I mean, just because the requirements of the code haven't been met in a way that was anticipated, even if those solutions still meet the design requirements, they should also be approved. And like I said before, the code should have the opportunity to be amended and flexed where needed. And where that happens, those changes should be worked through collaboratively. So just wrapping up, what does the National Model Design Code do? It's really, really useful. It provides the rules of engagement and it provides the topics for discussion. So if nothing else, it allows for people like ourselves, for applicants, designers, local authorities, stakeholders, residents to start to talk about design and state, what's important. Different elements of those design code, design criteria will be more important in certain areas and they should be focused upon. It's quite often missed and forgotten about, and Gary said it earlier, in addition to the National Model Design Code, there's another 100 or so pages which are guidance notes for the design code. So that provides a lot more detail and a lot more information. So in summary, I recommend that when writing these design codes, when we're trying to create great places, really understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. What's the vision for the site? What is it? What type of place are you trying to create? And it sounds silly and sounds simple, but write the code to deliver that vision. Make sure that you've got that vision forefront of your mind when writing that code all the time. And the last point there, be confident in the level of detail provided. If you've got an aspect or a design principle that's very, very important, give a higher level of detail for that aspect. Be very confident in what you're trying to provide. So that's it from me, Gary. I appreciate, I think we're going to have a quick break now. People can get their questions in on the chat and we'll discuss them later.
Luke, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. I appreciate we're sort of a bit pushed for time. What I'm going to say is if everyone could be back for 12:30, then that gives us half an hour to go through the chat box, answer questions, get a discussion going between ourselves. And we're aiming to wrap up at 1, if that's okay. So if people could do, brilliant, let's get those questions through. I really want to get, I've been making notes and I've got some questions myself. So while I'm waiting for this collection of questions to come through, I want to ask the panel, why do we think government is doing this, particularly this, of all the possible design initiatives that could have been taken? A national model design code, to my mind, strikes me as being potentially incredibly ambitious and also very resource hungry. Why do you think that this option was taken over certain other routes that were available? I don't know who wants to jump in on that, but it would be interesting. I want to get to the kind of philosophy of why use this particular system or this tool.
I can start, Gary, if you want. I think the easy answer is why are they doing it? Because they're getting serious about design. And why this avenue? Because it works. And I think what we've seen, and I quickly kind of canted through, the design climate of the last couple of years, building better, building beautiful. The health implications, I think the fact BFL 12 has changed to BHL, Building for a Healthy Life, we started to place greater emphasis on our health, our mental health, our physical health, our well-being. And what we've started to realize, we've always known it, but we started to actually answer to it, is that our built environments have a massive impact upon our health and well-being. So I think that's why it's got important. That's why it's absolutely crucial. I think if anything, this COVID crisis and lockdown has shown even more that where we live plays a massive part in our moods, in our outlook, in our lifestyle. And then so to go one step further, as you say, why coding, Gary? I think because coding is adaptable. We can get a design code for a 20 home development, or we can get a code for a 10,000 home new sustainable urban extension. And the level of detail within those codes can be proportionate depending on the requirements of that development. So I think codes are a very, they can be if written well, they can be a very clear instruction book on how to deliver great design. And like I said before, that instruction book provides a great benchmark for both the local authority and the applicant.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to mention anything? I'm thinking that I'm wondering now, the next question to my mind is, so we have this new tool, but how does it slot in with how we've been doing things? And I can't remember who mentioned it, but someone alluded to the planning white paper and the mention of zoning. And I'm wondering what kind of reform is required within our planning system to accommodate coding in the way that is being suggested by government. I don't know if anyone here has had an experience with working in a zonal planning system. I mean, we're a bit, this country, yeah, Laura, I was going to say, you must come in on this one. I was going to say, we're a bit of an anomaly in this country in that we don't have a zonal planning system. Our planning system is actually very different to a majority. So, Laura, do you want to give your view on the pluses and minuses of that?
I can give my experience from the New World, which is a different world completely. But I trained in Buenos Aires, and everything works in coding in South America. And I think, to start with, why the government decided to go for codes is a very good way to devolve power. So when we're looking at the devolution of power and giving power to local authorities, coding is a very good instrument to do that. And it's not as resource consuming as the current British planning system. Is a lot more savvy in terms of managing resources. The experience of the New World is that it had to be built very, very fast, and it had to be delivered. There was nothing there. Argentina was empty, and it had to be delivered in no time, and it had to be right. And so codes work for that. But the difference I see is that there was an empty landscape over there, and codes were being done at a local authority level in a way of creating character from scratch almost. So you code the character. The difference within the British system is that we have to go back, interpret the character that we already have, and then code so that we prolong that, and then there will be the debate. Do we need to prolong character? Do we need to retain it? Do we need to change it? And I'm not sure we are sufficiently equipped with skills and resources to do that massive work. It's different when you have nothing to start from, because you are creating something new. My experience is that in South America, codes work and don't work. They work really well in terms of speeding up the building process and the planning process, not using resources, and they work very well in terms of managing issues like party walls, conflicts, and things like that, because you can code all of that. But in terms of protecting quality of what gets built, they don't work as well as we think they do. That's my opinion.
Okay, well, that's an interesting take. I mean, it does feel to me that we are in a process in terms of our learning from other models. It does feel, from what I've read, that we are looking west rather than looking east to the continent. We're looking west and possibly even to places like South Africa and maybe Australia for how they do kind of area-based coding exercise, which is interesting because you're right. That point you make about it being much more kind of almost like a terraforming exercise where you're transforming something that is not inhabited into something else. Whereas obviously we have a much more knotty and complicated history of how we inhabit our landscape and so on and so forth. Yeah, it's interesting if coding is the right tool. Can
I make a point on that, Gary?
Yeah.
Just a quick interesting point, because I'm a very big fan of history. And interestingly enough, when in 1660s, when Spain they wrote the code for building in the New World, and this is the conquerors we're talking about. They built up all these massive codes, 10 books, but that was to apply in the new continent. They didn't apply that in Spain. That is one for thought.
I'm not quite clear in my own mind as well what the benefits are of sort of going through a large characterization process, coding your whole town, and which in itself is quite an exercise. Where does that kind of get you in terms of what you then do with the development site down the road? Or because presumably we're not intent on copying the Victorian terraces on the next street in the same way. So you've coded that. How does that help you then code for development on your site, which presumably really has to be site specific to that location?
Well, that's a very interesting. Sorry, Lou, I've cut across you. That's a very interesting point, isn't it? It's the danger of coding is if you're not sufficiently aware of the qualities rather than the process, is that you end up kind of keeping. You decode something that isn't very good, and then you recode it and deliver more of it. And if you're looking at a lot of settlements where they're growing at the edges. And we just know that quality tends to grade from the center to the edge in the way that we don't want it to. Quite often we have beautiful historic town centers with some pretty ropey kind of development around its edge that no sane person would say, right, we'll decode the qualities of that, whatever they may be, and rolling them out a bit more. So that I think is a key thing. It's not just about the process of coding, but it's, as I think you've all alluded to, is understanding the quality of the outcome that you want.
But the quality of the outcome in the sense of, if you want 35% of your facade to be glazed, do you have a bay window, that reflects maybe the character of the sort of the bay windows nearby? The quality of that becomes difficult because, do you have to code the depth of reveal to those windows so they're not flat up to the facade? Do you have to say, they're not GRP bay windows that are just bolted onto the front of the building? Because the developer might say, well, we're code compliant, we've got 35% glazing and we've got a bay window. So,
Phil, this is exactly why we shouldn't necessarily be prescribing the solutions. What we should be doing is just highlighting what the vision is for these places. So jumping back a little bit, I don't think we're looking to code whole towns or whole villages or regions. We're looking to code those development areas. And jumping back even again to what Gary was saying, in terms of this zonal system, we'll be looking to code those development sites. Those development sites is going to be really, really important in identifying what the vision is for those. And that's why I think it's absolutely crucial that we don't prescribe those very, very detailed solutions unless we have to for certain reasons. What we need to do is say what the vision is and see how we can get there. But going back, Gary, to how you're saying about the zoning system, I think, and it's come up a lot in the questions in the Q&As down the side there, this the idea of engagement, and what's going to happen is, in order for, so I think that codes are good if codes are written well, and crucially if codes are enforced. So if people accord with a code, they should get their approval and there should be incentive to following them. In order to do that, the codes need to be well written, and in order to do that, they need to be well consulted on. I think this new planning system and planning white paper is going to see that our consultation and our engagement needs to be at the very, very start. It needs to be at the very start, it needs to be comprehensive, and it needs to be inclusive. And it's so, so important through this new planning process to get all of the foundations right, because that's the chance that most people have got to influence the decisions. And it's only there when you get the foundations right at the very start that this zoning system of planning and then this coding system of design will be effective.
I agree. And can I add a little thing to that? And I think we're missing the point in that we're not talking enough about the establishment of a delivery vehicle for these codes. And I totally agree with Luke in this. What we had in Nottingham, which really, really helped, was an urban room, which was an open forum, a body of partnerships, everybody interested in design quality in the city. If you start doing those partnerships ahead, and instead of coming from either a local authority, it becomes a neutral body, somewhere completely open to debate. We need to think, how are we going to deliver this code rather than just being another document written by a local authority. I think the process of how we're going to do this is the most relevant, and it has to be right from the beginning.
No, I'd agree with that. I'm looking, Julie's very helpfully put together an ensemble of questions, and I can see more coming in the chat box. I have to say right now, apologies if we don't get to your question. It's there's quite a lot going on. I've got a few questions here that I'm going to group under highways. There's a comment here about manual streets, and Phil, I think you mentioned in your presentation how we've had manual for streets for a very long time now, 1 and 2. There is a new manual for streets coming, and it's unfortunate that the timings lined up the way that they did, in that the National Model Design Code has been launched with references to a document that no one's seen yet. But a frustration, and I know from a design side of things, is that quite often a lot of ideas around quality and in parts of the built environment that are quite susceptible to low cost change, public realm, that kind of thing, rather than buildings which can get very expensive very quickly. But there has been a resistance or a problem through our highways delivery systems. How do you think the National Model Design Code can work with our highways authorities and our highways approaches? And you know, it seems to me that if it can't, that's going to be a huge avenue of quality, pardon the pun, that we are not going to be able to use. So does anyone want to come in on their experiences with design coding for highways? I could talk about it for hours, none of it good.
I think the problem is that the government's coming at this from the planning perspective, and they're telling planners that highways need to be better designed, higher quality environments for people, and the planning process can solve that. But the highways authority are not the planning authority, and they have the ultimate say on whether they will adopt that street or not. And for all sorts of different reasons, they're not on this agenda by and large. In many instances, it's not to say there aren't highway engineers that wouldn't agree with what we're trying to do. The reality is they're up against it in terms of resourcing and the ability to maintain these sorts of spaces. So there's all that as a backdrop as well. And really, there probably needs to be perhaps a more of a direct approach through sort of Highways Act and making that a function of placemaking and not just highway design and adoption.
Yeah, I think
perhaps there is a point here for restructuring government altogether from the higher spheres, because the way we need to think about place is not it's not reflected by the way government is structured.
Yeah, I think that disconnect between the Highways Authority and the Planning Authority is one of the fundamental frustrations in the design process. So as a designer, it's so disheartening to develop a great scheme in collaboration with local authority planners, only then for the highways to take it in a different direction. It then goes in a different direction, only to take it back to the planners who don't like the way it's gone. So I think that we've got the opportunity here to bridge that gap, to remove that disconnect. And like I said before, we need to be engaging and working collaboratively on these from an early stage. Why not use the design code as the mechanism to bring together the planners and the Highways Authority? If we agree that we can have, I don't know, turning radii of 1 meter on lower order roads, and that's agreed upon and put it within the design code, then that should be honoured for the applicants further down the line. So let's do the hard work up front and then get quicker delivery further on.
I think that would be ideal. I do wonder, just as a not to put a negative on it, I do wonder, given the problems, those of us who are involved in the rollout of manual for streets, the fact that, I mean, I know from bitter experience that I'm still seeing references to Design Bulletin 32 in highways discussions around design, a document that has been superseded for over a decade. It is difficult it's difficult to know if this is possible with just through process, or whether you do need, as Laura was mentioning, some kind of fundamental reworking where the agendas are forced to align rather than you attempt to do it through discourse. I'm not giving up all hope, but it does seem difficult. There's a ton of questions here. I mean, the one that strikes me as somebody who I was actually looking back the other day, and I've done about 12 design codes now. I didn't even realize I'd done 2. They take bloody years and they're really resource heavy. Can we realistically do this? And if not, what do we have to do it? I mean, there's a few questions in the chat about resourcing or hinting around resourcing. And Luke, your mention of co-production, I think, is part of the way there. Anyone else got any comments on just where we apply our time and effort?
My feeling is that it's it comes across as being a pretty mammoth task, and a lot of very resource intensive from a local authority point of view. And I think how we scope the document, or whatever it is we want, however it is we're going to approach this, is going to be critical to, how then it goes forward. So Luke's already suggested that it should probably apply to specific development sites, and I'd agree with that. I don't think you can kind of code for whole areas, but thinking a couple of steps ahead, if we're looking at more of a sort of a zone-based system, then coding for those zones, whether that's a growth zone or a renewal zone, is there something in the background to this where there's an intention that we should be coding for all those zones? So if you've got an area that's maybe a renewal zone, can you build in back garden? Should we be trying to code for that kind of scenario? I don't know whether that's sort of perhaps part of the agenda. It's not clear to me, but I think focusing it on sites is the way to go. But how is that different from a development brief? Probably more of an engagement process and trying to bring people with you rather than coming along with a predisposed solution and then asking people what they think.
I mean, I will confess to being quite a dogmatist about what I think a design code is historically, and I am worried about the dilution of language and meaning around these things. To me, a guide and a code are not interchangeable. They do very different jobs, and they are written for very different audiences as well. So there is certainly in the wording around this, for me, it does feel like it's not something you should be blurring the meaning of at this stage, because it does have a meaning, certainly to the design industry. And I can imagine the wider public are not used to working with design codes. Most planners aren't used to working with design codes, so to get other people to pick this up.
I think you're right, Gary, and I think that's one of the potential pitfalls of the new approach to coding and the zoning planning system, if it does come in. Like I said before, in order for people to effectively influence it, that has to be done at the very, very earliest stage. And it's generally only when someone's building at the bottom of their garden do members of the public start to get involved and start to get an interest in it. The trouble is, at that point, it will be too late. So I think as professionals, we have a duty, if this comes forward, to engage with people and actively engage with people from an early stage. And I just wanted, I've seen, sorry Gary, doing your job for you, I've seen a few comments come up in the questions there.
Someone has to.
about what these codes can include. And ultimately, these codes can and should include what's needed to be covered to deliver great places. So someone started talking about deprived areas and levelling up access to local communities and facilities. Can that be in the code? Absolutely. Someone started talking about renewable energies, PV panels, slightly more innovative ways of getting solar panels on. Can this be in the design code? Absolutely. And this is why it's really, really important that these design codes are written well and they're consulted upon and they're engaged with people who actually know the local area, they know the local context. And ultimately, and I keep saying it, that there's a clear vision for the place that people are trying to create. If there's a clear vision and this place is that it's highly accessible, it's highly sustainable, it focuses on renewable resources, great, you've got such a clear vision. Clearly, you would then have all of those elements within the design code.
But I think it does have to link back to policy. So if your local plan policy doesn't, require you or express a need for renewable energy, I don't know whether you could then require that through the code. So that we do have to sort of link this back to what your local plan policy says. I don't think it's kind of, you can have whatever you want. So you have to navigate this somehow and manage those expectations.
We found that in Nottingham, when we were writing this, we found that, that there were some very lovely things to have, but weren't covered by policy. So when you come to the point of implementation and, how do you ask for it if you're not backed up by policy? And our code's going to become policy. In that case, how do they line up with everything else that is there? And then there is the other issue. And somebody posed this question, and I found it really, really interesting. We went around this in Nottingham somehow. I'll explain. But somebody asked, are authorities that are more ambitious with goals at a risk of pushing development out because you are asking for more, say, renewable energies? and land value will not allow you to do that. So you've got to consider the financials as well, and the fact that if you're coding, code has to be, you have to comply with the code. It's not like guidance. And then somebody will have to assess that. And if there are barriers, if the code becomes a barrier that you cannot deliver it because of financial or technical constraints, then there is no use of the code. So really, it's a really careful balance here. That's why it's good to code intention. It's good to code the vision rather than coding the particulars.
What I can't quite get my, sorry, Luke, I was going to say, what I can't quite get my head around, and it sort of comes back to something you were saying earlier, is that if you're coding for the vision, that can leave an awful lot of wiggle room. And if you're not being specific, then I think we're opening ourselves up to getting more of the same. And if we're getting more of the same, then what's the point of doing a design code? The whole point of this is that we're raising the bar, isn't it?
I mean, it's my experience anyway that the design code is not the place for any visioning work. In the kind of traditional sense, a design code is a kind of dense technical document that is all about the parametrics. It's all about what you have to do to deliver the vision, but the visioning work's done elsewhere. All the work around deciding the outcome is done elsewhere and describing the outcome. And a code is a document that you can pick up cold. You don't even have to understand what it is you're trying to achieve. All you have to do is follow the rules, a bit like a manual for assembly. And a well-written code will allow that disconnect between having to understand everything about everything before you can actually deliver a decent product, which is much more realistically how we work in this country, which is people don't have the time. They are just given a site, and you need to know what goes on it and what you have to do to get through and deliver the right product. So there is when I saw that initial process in the national model, as much as I appreciate that work needs to be done, what is code and what is vision, and what it's starting to get a bit blurrier than I was initially happy with, if I'm honest.
You're right, Gary, and I think that's why I think it might have been my final bullet point was be confident in the level of detail that you're providing, and I think you're right, Phil. That there, if something is absolutely crucial and paramount, give it a higher level of detail and rigor to answer. And I think my penultimate point was in reference to what you were just saying, Laura, is that it's a considered balance. These absolutely have to be viable, deliverable developments. So if renewables is absolutely top of your requirement, then you're going to have to balance that cost elsewhere. So yeah, that's either going to require maybe allowing additional dwellings, or it's going to mean a shortfall in something elsewhere.
That's why it's so important that the code is co-written.
Yes.
With developers and with designers.
Yeah, and you engage with those that know, ecologists, local authorities, people who live there, people who live nearby, people who walk their dog there, landscape architects. This really has to be a multi-dis process.
How many local authorities do you think are kind of geared up for that?
I'm not here to comment, but I know certainly those that I've spoke to, a lot feeling daunted by this prospect, Phil. So I'm guessing you kind of sit in that same camp. Yeah,
it's potentially quite a significant change in the way that we do things, and I think in the way that the community engagement takes place as well. If we're looking at site-specific landowner-led types locations for this kind of thing, then it's the landowners that have to be maybe leading on some of that, and be bringing people along as perhaps not equal partners, but as part of that process. So, where does that responsibility lie? Is it local authority managing the community engagement on behalf of the landowner, or is the landowner coordinating that? We have to have these conversations, I think, to work out how that's going to work through.
And then there is the issue of trust. The issue of trust, which you mentioned before, is incredibly relevant to make sure that when you try to engage, you develop that level of trust, because otherwise it's not going to work. The process is not going to work. I have to say something positive in the midst of all this. Yes, it's incredibly difficult, time consuming, you need skills and all that, but it's so much fun. Come on, let's embrace it. It's so much fun, honestly.
No, I'd agree with that. We've only got a few minutes left. The NPPF does provide a range of design quality tools. Obviously, the National Model Design Code is the one we're focusing on. what's going to be the role of these other tools? We do have guides, we do have Building for a Healthy Life, which I know is name checked as Building for Life 12 in the NPPF, but has moved on. We have Design Review, which obviously Design Midlands offers. How are all of these tools going to mesh together, do we think? Or is there a danger that the National Model Design Code supersedes a lot of this stuff by building in the assumption that if you meet its criteria, you are delivering quality, therefore you don't need to be audited?
Is there? I was thinking in terms of sort of compliance statements. You know, if you're making a submission,
the
onus should be on the developer to demonstrate how they are complying with the code, and perhaps require less local authority time in terms of, you know, checking all the details. We can zoom in on the areas of interest specifically to see how close they are to the mark or not, in terms of how it sort of fits with that. I think there's a role for area-wide guides in terms of more generic good practice design principles, and I think that's a lot of authorities have those already. Maybe they need to be updated in light of current thinking on the National Model Design Code, but I think that's certainly, it's almost like the National Design Guide, it sort of sits above the National Model Design Code. It's the good practice principles that you then sort of filter down. Yeah,
that does seem to be the way it's structured to me as well. They're not flat. They do have that tiered kind of feel to it.
I sense, can I add a little thing? I sense that in the long term, the idea is that we're going to spend some time with overlapping different documents, but the idea is to move towards design codes, make everybody feel confident with it, and that's when the transition will go to the new way of planning. That's my interpretation.
Interesting. Luke, do you have any closing remarks or final thoughts?
I just think it's great, Gary. Ultimately, all of this design guidance out there can only do one thing, and that's pushing design quality upwards. The fact that we're all here together talking about it is great. I think the important thing is to go away from today and keep talking about it. Get involved, respond to the consultation. All of these questions and thoughts and ideas you've come up with are fantastic. Let MHCLG know that.
Definitely.
Respond back. So I think it can only be positive. And ultimately, I think just keep in your minds that everyone wants to create great places. No one is setting out to create bad places. Everyone wants to create great places. Let's come together, pull together, work together, and deliver great places.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. That was a very positive note. Yeah, I know I've expressed a kind of reticence around certain aspects of it, but it wasn't that long ago that design quality was just not on the agenda, and it was not really being discussed in any way that was being reflected in government initiatives. And we had a kind of wilderness years of losing a lot of our tried and tested design guidance and design supports. So for me, it's great to see these discussions happening. And you're right, it's an exciting opportunity, it's an exciting change. Yeah, I'll be interested to see how it pans out. We are 1 minute over, so I feel very rude for keeping you. So my final thing to say is thank you very much for the panelists. You've been brilliant, as I knew you would be. We had no doubt, of course. That was a really good discussion. Thank you everyone who has come along and asked questions, brilliant questions. It's good to see you listening, it's always great. And apologies to anybody whose questions we didn't get to, it was just so many. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event on the 17th. So thanks very much. Also, thanks to Joe and Julie. I don't want to kind of downplay how much work goes on in the background to make these things happen. A huge amount goes into this. So thank you everyone for turning up, and thank you everyone for getting involved. Take care.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks,
bye.